So welcome back for the second part. So as I said, we were tracking on the first part. So I would like to give the opportunity to the project expert to intervene or ask any question around, in relation to the entire discussion has been done in the first part. Very, very, very short question, 30 seconds with very, very, very short and concise answers. So who would like to comment and ask something? Any project expert?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to ask experts a question of how the answer would be different. Let's say if you would mainly consider value-added tax fraud. Is that discussion very different from when we speak about direct taxes, or is it? Would you consider the discussion to be similar in relation to, for example, recoveries, remedies of value-added tax frauds? And as well of these questions of enforcement and whether tax fraud is actually a crime. I'm looking more really for a value-added tax and whether you could share some experience with value-added tax fraud.
Okay, so basically, you know, a specification of VAT. We've looked also at the sectors, so the issues with, you know, the enforcement, prevention. Is there any specificity about VAT in terms of relevance of sectors or these things?
Yes, I think, you know, what we've been talking about the fact that HMRC prioritized civil procedure to criminal. It actually goes back to history. Before the merger in 2005, that was what the Inland Revenue did for direct taxes, because they dealt with, you know, both individuals, gentlemen who should not be disturbed with the criminal law. That was the origins. By contrast, at the time, the former Customs and Excise prioritized criminal law. So there was a big difference between the Inland Revenue dealing with direct taxes and the Customs and Excise dealing with indirect taxes, VAT, stamp, and others. But when they merged in 2005, the general approach was the Inland Revenue direct tax civil approach. But even within the combined departments, there are more application of the criminal law in indirect taxes than indirect.
Thank you very much. Very short, but very interesting historical approach. And Dilpreet.
I was just going to say, just building on the historical approach, the Institute for Fiscal Studies did a really interesting paper on this, but effectively saying that historically, and so since Mead and since the infamous Mead report in the 70s, there has been a big shift in our reliance on from direct taxes to indirect taxes in terms of the amount of revenue that's generated, and so the propensity for fraud has therefore shifted from that more into the indirect taxes. And I think given that VAT in particular is a transactional tax, at each stage of the chain, there is an opportunity that arises there. I think there is a difference in the type of fraud one sees between the indirect and the direct taxes.
Fantastic, very punctual. Any other project expert?
Costa, I had a question. To the extent it hasn't been touched upon, I'd be interested to see what sorry for the dog barking, what the panel's reaction is to the Panama Papers and any impact that has had on UK tax policy.
From a sort of a pragmatic perspective, I think it had a fantastic impact. I think anything that can bring things into the public domain of this nature is great, and it drives change. So similar to bribery and corruption, you know, if we can reveal what's really going on to the populace, use the media to good effect to actually, you know, articulate that. So I think that continues to be, you know, one of the best ways to drive cultural attitude change, to say, look, you know, what's going on, you know, how these people are hiding their money, you know, to level out, you know, society to a better degree. So I think that was, you know, a fantastic reveal to show really what was going on across the globe. So personally, I think it was effective.
I think just building on Mike's point really quickly, I think it did a great deal to raise awareness of just how deep and far-reaching this problem is. Practically, I cannot identify something concrete that the government actually implemented as a result of the Panama Papers. There was a lot of talk, There's a lot of heightened awareness, and that's very good to get discussions going. But there's targeted problems, and I think Lloydette touched on this earlier, which is sort of specifically saying, right, you can't do this scheme, or that scheme now needs to be addressed with this specific DOTAS or TOTAS or something else, or overarching policies that are so wide they lack the specificity to be meaningful. So I think practically there's yet to be some action.
Great, and this is, I think, the best opening for our second part, because in this second part, we will look at try to unveil the interconnection between these tax crimes and corruption. And so you are raising a question. You said, the question is why they didn't do anything. No, so this is the question we try to look at and answer. So let's go. And the first question is related to the role of enablers and facilitators. And you were already touching it in several ways. You touched that. So the complexity of the legal advice and so on. So this is extremely important. And we had a symposium 2 days ago, and this emerged as a global issue that we had to discuss. So the first question here is, according to your experience, which categories of professional enablers, so bankers, brokers, accountants, internal auditors, external auditors, tax lawyers, are the most involved in facilitation of tax crimes?
I was laughing when I read the question, because it's obviously every tax practitioner's worst nightmare, because you try and advise in good faith. And so I think when you say which categories are most involved, I think flipping it on its head, it's almost to say which category of those professions is the most offensive at the time. So, 5 to 7 years ago, bankers were the most offensive and heinous individuals. Currently, the flavor of the month appears to be, or flavor of the year is, the professional advisors. And so there is a real resistance even on professional advisors' part to say, well, I'm going to advise you in good faith. What you choose to do with it is on your head.
This is a very good question answer, but basically we are not trying to it's just something like a phenomenological emergence here that we are discussing. For example, from the Bulgarian workshop, was very clear that almost in every scheme there is an accountant. Lawyers are present in high-level schemes, but not in basic schemes. But they cannot be a scheme without an accountant, actually. So this is what emerged, for example, in Greece too. So this is the way we are, the line of inquiry. So any other intervention here?
Yes. So I'll say, obviously, there's a difference between evasion and avoidance, but in most cases, it's a combination. So in evasion, because you're looking for outright concealment, you look for bankers who can go to Australia and Switzerland where there is banking secrecy. So bankers tend to lead in evasion, high-level offshore evasion. But when it comes to avoidance, bankers are still there to provide the paper transactions. Accountants are there to devise the scheme. Lawyers are very, very important because you need someone to write an opinion to tell the potential customers that this is legal. So it serves to two purposes. It persuades the taxpayers to buy the schemes, and if in the unlikely event that the revenue brings a prosecution, they could claim that they acted on legal advice. That's, in English, it's almost a complete defense, both to criminality and the penalty in civil. So in most tax avoidance schemes, you have an accountant and a lawyer. And the bigger it is, the more you need a bank, because lawyers are very important because they provide the opinion, which gives both the other promoters and the taxpayers legal cover for dishonesty.
This is interesting. This is the combined approach. One is the architect, the other one is the evaluator, the legal evaluator. This is very clear. Yes.
Costa, I would also add that the additional role that lawyers, whilst I, as a lawyer myself, am reluctant to say this, they do play a pivotal role as enablers. But I think their role extends a bit further than just giving an opinion. Their role also extends into creating the mechanisms that a company can use, or an individual can use lawfully often, to evade tax. So, you think about shell companies often they are created by lawyers. And so their role is really key in this discussion around enablers. Whilst I don't want, every lawyer to be vilified as an enabler, I think as a profession,
no,
we
this
do
is very
have to
clear.
accept
This is very clear. And I'm a lawyer in 2 jurisdictions, as you know, in Italy and as a solicitor in England and Wales. And I practice over 10 years as a criminal defense lawyer. We are not, that's not the purpose, but this is very interesting what you said. And so I think that this can be related also to the thing that in this jurisdiction, basically financial the services are very important. So the offshore creation of shell company is more important. So different from a country like Bulgaria, I think that here the role of lawyers as enablers is more important because of the complexity. So if you agree with that, I think that was the point that you wanted to make, and I think it's a very good point. So now these professionals are usually subject to self-regulation. They have independent bodies and they have to have a license. How often do you think in this jurisdiction they are applied, debarred, or their disciplinary measures applied to them when they are involved in unethical practice or illegal practices? Is this happening a lot? From your experience, is this not happening? I don't want to say to you the emergency of other countries. So,
Costa, I just want to go back actually, just sorry to that previous question to a degree. I think one of the issues generally with the conversation around this is when we say enabler, I think you have almost the accidental enabler. And I think as was being described there really articulately, they're creating mechanisms that are legitimate mechanisms that can be used to facilitate the tax fraud and tax crime. So I think on one side, you've got legitimate enablers, the accidental enablers, who aren't doing anything, with mischievousness or malfeasance, and then you've got the criminal enablers. So I think for the purpose of the conversation, are we talking about criminal enablers who know what they're doing?
To clarify, we are not talking just on criminal accomplices here. So not only the ones that are actively involved, but also the ones that in a way are passive. So they turn a blind eye and they allow this to happen. So that sometimes they cannot be recognized as, as perpetrators. So yeah, a broader approach. So we are discussing about including both of them.
Okay, super, thank you.
So I think that question is that what normally happens in the system, particularly those regulated by professional bodies, so the bar by the Bar Standards Board, solicitors by the Law Society, and accountants by the IFA, and then their various professional bodies. The thing is that they won't be reported until something goes belly up for the taxpayer. So even if they are doing something that's perhaps not quite within the confines of the law, might be described as enabling tax evasion, there is the issue that it's only until something happens to the taxpayer, and only if the taxpayer really feels that they were hard done by their professional accountant. And at that point, there are certainly cases that crop up, but I'm not sure that they make up the vast majority of cases in which professionals are reported for various misconduct offences. Okay, so there is basically underreporting, and in these cases because of this mechanism that you said. If there is nothing else that you would like to add?
Just a quick one. Yeah, so what I would say from my experience, it goes back again to the very few prosecutions being brought. Most of the professional bodies, they only take action when their member have been convicted of a crime. And if there's no conviction, they don't tend to do anything. I'll just give 2 quick examples. There's a chartered tax advisor called Porter that did a tax film schemes. He was prosecuted. So both the Chartered Institute of Taxation and the other accounting body struck him off after the conviction. And if you look, if anyone has read the Rangers case, you see that as the accountant and tax advisor that did the scheme, he lied in court. He did all sorts of things, including meeting a witness at the airport to get them to change their witness. But because the matter was a civil case between Rangers and HMRC, nothing has happened to him. In fact, he was described as Mr. Red in court. I know who he is. He still practices. So the bodies in the UK only take action where there has been a criminal conviction.
Okay. Anybody else on this point? Let's go on. So the second part of this sub-questions is, something related to the contiguity between enablers, so professionals and authorities, how this contiguity hampers, in a way, enforcement or anti-tax evasion strategies. We are not looking yet at the macro level, so the policy level and the legislation level. We are looking still at the practical enforcement actions. And in that regard, the contiguity, of course, we would like to look also at a phenomenon that emerges very important, and is the revolving door phenomenon. So you know exactly what is it. So when somebody comes from the HMRC and goes in a law firm or vice versa, this is happening everywhere. So how do you think this is affecting, in a way, the anti-tax evasion efforts in our jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem in the UK. There's a revolving door between the tax avoidance industry and HMRC, and a revolving door between the tax avoidance industry and the judiciary. Just to explain that, at every level, from relatively junior HMRC staff to the head of HMRC, who are lawyers, they tend to move from private practice as lawyers to HMRC. The penultimate last head of HMRC was a partner in private practice in the 70s and in the 80s and 90s, and later joined the Treasury and became head of HMRC. And when he retired, he went back to private practice. So there's no bar to that. And also, when it comes to the judiciary, I talked about barristers writing opinions used to sell tax schemes. Now, that type of practice doesn't stop you from being a judge. So we have had judges who did this as barristers, and they are appointed into the judiciary, and they tend to be the people that lead in tax cases. So when I talked about this UK approach that the judges developed, whereby any scheme that is not specifically outlawed, they allow it, that's part of, whether conscious or unconsciously, the judges tend to see themselves as defenders of the tax avoidance industry when they do their job.
Okay, this is very interesting. Any other comment? So maybe we can look at this from the perspective of anti-corruption, and maybe Ladette can delve a bit into that. We both work at the Serious Fraud Office over that, and we know very well that there is a passage from the Serious Fraud Office to the Magic Circle. So is this problematic, or do you think this is just okay?
To some extent, Costa, it is problematic, but the difficulty is, what do you do about that? I don't think that there is, the SFO is a very fantastic example of that revolving door in both directions. You have those who are desperate from the private practice to move into an organization like the SFO because it gives them the ability to understand how the organization works. It increases their ability to then move out of the SFO after a couple of years, 3-4 years, and then obtain partnership or very senior roles in law firms because of the value that they bring, having been within the prosecutorial agency. But I think at the end of the day, whilst that is something that is not necessarily undesirable, I think it is the way that it is. And I think there is an issue, especially with the government, the current administration, I think also previous administration, there is a little bit of an obsession with private practice and those in private practice. And so there has been a very concerted move by government to bring those from the private sector into government organizations, including HMRC, actively encouraging that, and including the SFO, in the hope that having those who are in private practice, because supposedly, they're a bit snappier, a bit more cutthroat, can sort of help bring the organization up a bit. And so it's actually now become, in my view, government policy to encourage much more of that fluidity between the public sector and the private sector. It may not be desirable, but that's the way the machine works.
No, this is very interesting. So, and of course there are some advantages in the passage. There is no problem with that. But can you a bit expand on why it is undesirable? So of course there can be the issue of brain drain, but when we look at the corruption, I think you were mentioning some other elements. Can you expand on that?
There are benefits to it, and I'm certainly not a detractor of it. I recognize the benefits that it brings to the organization. But I think some of the problems that we do have is that, number one, you have that brain drain. It means that those who are within the organization, they're really there for a fixed period of time. If you think about how long an average SFO case lasts, minimum on a good day, 3 years, on a really bad day, 10 years. And so, when you have individuals constantly flowing in and out of the organization or regularly, it means that there's a lack of continuity in terms of those who lead those cases and manage them. I think also then, having those who have worked within the organization immediately jump into private practice, again, it's a personal decision, and I don't think you can stop people from doing that. But, we need to possibly look at whether or not, the rules around we've got the Official Secrets Act, which prevents individuals from discussing cases that they've been involved in. But I don't necessarily know if there's anything else that could be done to strengthen that. So the classic example that I would give is the former director of the SFO, David Green, leaving the SFO. And David was my former boss, both at the SFO and actually at Revenue, the former Revenue and Customs Prosecution Office, which was my original home department. So I have a lot of time for him. He moved from the SFO upon conclusion of his term as director into Slaughter and May. And there were lots of, people were slightly disconcerted about that. But, there is, and the reasons why were because obviously there are cases that Slaughter and May are currently instructed in that David was overseeing, back then.
This is clear. This is clear, and then it's clear also the problem, and the problem related to the solutions is it's a big issue. What to do? Yeah, but thank you. I think that we analyzed that, but also the last thing that emerged from what you said in the first session that is relevant, I think, here with Enable is a macro level analysis. Is that we're speaking about the integrity of lawyers, accountants, and professionals like us, but is it possible for you to ask a professional to reach a certain level of integrity when the system seems to be affected by lack of integrity? When for it's this possibility of using overseas territories is something that is structured and an option that is given by the legal framework itself, how we can ask this professional to not be facilitators? What are your comments on this?
So I think it sounds like a flippant answer, but I will explain it. But I think it goes down to the fallibility of being human. We are ultimately influenced by the environment around us, what we see, what we do. And that's where I think Lloydette touched upon, which was being able to have some sort of structure in place that allows for that more objective sense of integrity to be achieved. There should, in theory, be nothing wrong with, barristers do it all the time. We will act for both the revenue authority and for the taxpayer on, an array of very similar cases. Some might say, well, is your judgment not clouded at that point? I would say, well, I think it might make me, a better lawyer because I can see it from all the different angles. I'm not so wedded to one side, as it were. But I do think it's really important to be able to say, well, I can step back, or, and the English system, or the legal system does have the option to recuse yourself if you consider yourself to be conflicted. And that option does exist. There's the option also to invite a judge or to invite somebody to recuse themselves from a case. I have seen it take place, but it is so infrequent. And it is normally due to, interestingly, due to a close personal connection with the case, or because said entity was your former client. And there's got to be that really direct and tangible connection before the option to recuse comes in. And so there seems to be this underlying belief that on which the system is pinned that no, we will inherently be, very self-aware of our unconscious biases, which is oxymoronic in and of itself.
Deeprit, is a great answer. Thank you so much for that. And so anybody else about the tone of from the top, and when we say now from the top, from the government and the state itself? Rachel.
sorry, I was just going to say another dimension is that when we talk about the revolving door, I think often, especially for accountants, we're talking about sort of the big four or big accountancy firms. And so they're sharing their views in both forums, in the public and in the private. But of course, I'm not quite sure how much sharing there is between high street accountants, high street lawyers. These are the people who, as enablers, are probably more likely to be prosecuted actually than white, you know, big law firms or Deloitte's and EY and so on. And also, just to mention on a practical level, obviously my firm, we have lots of people who've worked at the SFO, FSA, things like that. Whenever they come, of course, everybody puts in Chinese walls. There's people in practice are very keen to make sure that there is no discussion of, or the person will never get to see anything about their case that's not in the public domain that they worked at as a prosecutor when they come into the firm. And I imagine that's probably, you know, done across the board. It should be done across the board. So it wouldn't be that people impact on the case that they've now worked on both sides of, but of course, you know, the know-how, that's very, very useful for private practice.
And what about Rachel? What about the relationships, the connections? Are they useful?
They do have practical uses in terms of if you want to raise a point with a prosecutor, you know, you might normally be maybe going in at a very low level who's not a decision maker, or somebody in fact who can't make that decision. And if somebody can practically say to you, actually that person will have no you know, input into that decision, go straight to this person, you know, of course, but in reality, you know, that is information that maybe should be more freely available to everybody in some way. So I wouldn't say that it's improper.
No, that's clear. That's a very good point. Okay, so now let's try to look at the overall, you know, the highest level. And when I say that, it's about, you know, this interconnection with the policy making, the process of decisional process in here. Of course, this is also related in a way to revolving door, but the top level, Rachel was saying, you know, the big four, for example, the top of the big four that becomes the director of HMRC. We had it, and so how this can affect in a way the system. And this is the issue of institutional corruption. So it's not always corruption in strict sensu, so something that is criminalized, of course, but we are speaking about unduly influence on the process, deliberation process, decision-making process in our democracies. And so free speech before I go in this, you know, I would like to know if there is any question related to that from the project experts.
Yes. Oh, so sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Brandon.
Sorry, I just, you know, great discussion. I was just thinking, we discussed revolving door and, you know, moving from private to public sector. Would you say that the introduction of DPAs and negotiations between corporations, lawyers, and government agencies kind of could take some risks associated with this, that these two parties comes closer? Is it associated, related to negotiations and DPAs?
Okay, this is a very good question. But let me reframe it, because we have a specific question on corporate liability. So for the aspects of how DPAs interact with enforcement, we will look at later on. But the most important aspect that Branislav is raising is also another one: the introduction of DPAs. So I mean, because we are speaking about this level of, you know, you touched that very well. There is a competitive disadvantage in a jurisdiction to be very tough on this kind of offenses. That was very clear on that. This is something that is very well studied. We know that very well. So the one point about institutional corruption is this undue influence, this lobbying that is done to create a framework that in a way, you know, restrict tax evasion to pure fraudulent actions and open wide the applicability of the gray area of tax avoidance. where we know very well that something is not considered, criminalizable. So what about this? What about this kind of undue influence on the decision-making process?
Yeah, I think that's a problem again, and I can use the HSBC example as a very good case. Now, what you have there is a situation where HMRC obtained evidence of clear criminality by HSBC and their customers. But the French authorities informed other countries in early 2010 that they had this document. Now, the then head of HMRC had a meeting with HMRC before going to France to collect the documents. And after collecting it, this is February 2010. By the end of 2010, the chairman of HSBC had become a government minister and a member of the House of Lords. And then in 2011, then HMRC now gave HSBC that deal. No criminal investigation, no disclosure of clients, just collect the tax and pay back to us. And then 2013, the head of HMRC that did the deal resigned from HMRC within 3 months. He joined HSBC as a consultant. Now, everybody agrees that the deal was a bad deal for the UK, but if you look at the circumstances under which the deal was done, you could see, whatever you want to call it, undue influence and opposition, it clearly didn't look right at all.
This is interesting. So going back to the question of Branislav. So for example, Odette was saying very clearly, very important point, Section 7 of Bribery Act was introduced, and it was really used a lot. But why it has been used only after the introduction of the DPA as an instrument? And I was participating in the first case, and it was, we don't have evidence of any big corporation that, was subject to Section 7 without a DPA. So this is the issue that we are looking at. Is this something that, what are the reasons behind this treatment? Competitive advantage? What is this?
Costa, could I just offer one piece of correction there? I think there is one prosecution by the SFO. I think there was a guilty plea in that, and I think it was the case of the Sweet Group, but I'll double check that for you in a moment, where I think that the individual was prosecuted for Section 7 and they pleaded guilty.
There will be the exception anyway. Yeah,
huh?
So it will be an exception. So
it was,
yeah,
absolutely. The rest of those have been DPAs.
So what do you think is that? Is that
well, the DPA system is a tool and a very useful one for prosecutors. I was the case lawyer for the second ever deferred prosecution agreement entered into by the SFO, SARCLAD, and we prosecuted the company for a number of pre-Bribery Act offences, as well as, I think, 1 or 2 post-Bribery Act offences. Or not prosecuted, but the charge sheet included pre- and post-Bribery Act. I think at the moment, the reality is that the SFO has a finite amount of resources, and so does every government department, and they have to make decisions about where they go with what they have. And that sounds rather vague. But the reality is the deferred prosecution agreement framework or regime is there for a specific purpose. I've said already that, average SFO case is 3 years. I know colleagues who've worked on cases like Alston for 10 years. It's simply not acceptable that shouldn't be the only remedy that is available to a corporate. You look currently, for example, at Petrofac, that has been under investigation by the SFO for almost 4 years, and the share price of that company has tanked, and they are on the edge of ruin. So we have to find resolutions to corporate criminal liability other than simply prosecuting companies. And whilst it may not be
this is clear. This is clear, and I know the issue about resources. I was investigating too, so I know that. But the issue here is also is there willingness to pursue this crime in a certain effective way. For example, I totally understand the issue about the DPAs for the corporate, but we also know that because of the use of the DPA, we relax a lot, and we use mainly internal investigation of the company. We don't go for full investigation because, of course, we don't have the resources, as you said, and then we don't have so many good cases against corporate executives. And at the same time, after the financial crisis, it has been introduced the accountability regime for senior managers, but it has been watered down in the parliament, and it has never been used. But from the case of the CEO of Barclays that tried to crack the anonymous system for a whistleblower that was bluntly evident illegal action. So we have an accountability regime. It was watered down, never really used. Why is that?
I think in tax, I don't think there has been any corporate tax prosecution in the UK, and because of that, there wouldn't been anything to defer. So in other words, there's never been a corporate tax prosecution in the UK. If you look at the latest OECD reports on fighting tax crime, they said that the UK did not provide any evidence of the enforcement of the criminal law against a corporate body.
Now, this is clear. We are trying to assess the macro level, so the decision process, the legislative or government influence on this.
Can I just address the question that you posed in relation to the prosecution or lack of successful prosecution of corporate executives? The Law Commission announced their consultation into corporate criminal liability probably about a month ago, and are asking for evidence from a range of stakeholders. And they're looking, again, at what needs to be done in relation to the corporate criminal liability landscape. But I think one of the issues that we have, which doesn't just affect corporates from the SFO's perspective, and obviously I'm no longer a part of the SFO, I have to make that abundantly clear, even though sometimes I say we. From their perspective, one of the difficulties in terms of prosecuting both corporates outside of the DPA regime, as well as senior executives, is the identification principle, and the difficulties that presents for the prosecutor in getting over that hurdle. And actually the Barclays case in 2019 has made that hill even higher. And so there is a need for some change. And we see the SFO's director and others, obviously those in private practice may not necessarily call for increased corporate criminal liability, but the reality is at the moment we've had 10 DPAs and no successful prosecutions as far as we know so far. That there's a problem. There's a problem within the system, and that has to be fixed. So it isn't just that but depends whether or not this government and this administration has the appetite for those changes to be made. We'll see what
this is very, very, very good. Deep read.
Just to add to that point, actually, Loida, and I think you've touched on something really, really important there, because if I recall correctly, and you can correct me on this actually, but the director of the SFO, I think Osofsky, had said at some point in an interview that, spend 20 years in jail, or why don't you wear a wire and come work for us? And so I wonder whether there are people who have been charged, not prosecuted because they've entered into an arrangement. I appreciate that with corporates, it may be trickier because you don't know, and I appreciate the problem you cite, which is, you don't know exactly which individuals you're targeting. You can't just say, right, I'm going after the entire organization when you're dealing with, tens of thousands of employees. But I wonder, because they are, and I think what she had said in that particular interview, and I was quite struck by it because I thought this is very much marrying up with, I think, what they do in the US, and that's exactly what she said. She said, they've seen success in the US using this method of getting kind of, the criminal to come onto your side, as it were. And I just wonder whether the successful prosecutions haven't resulted as a result of a number of things, partly because they can't identify the right people. Two, the incredibly high burden of proof that has to be discharged, which is beyond reasonable doubt. And thirdly, whether or not arrangements have been entered into, and these aren't arrangements that would be made public, because of course, what's the point of having, your mole planted, your whistleblower potentially planted, where everybody's going to know about them? So I wonder whether, and she made it quite clear that they, the SFO want to work very, very closely with HMRC So I wonder whether steps aren't already in place, and I can't say because I don't know, but I wonder whether they're trying to take sort of quieter steps that are far more agreeable to bigger corporates, so their names aren't brandished and tarnished in the press.
This is very good point. Three important elements. If we like to let the project expert join in, and then Lloydette can respond. Any additional integration or any other question from on this point of institutional corruption from project experts?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Exciting discussion.
Good. So if this is the case, so Lloydette.
So I think the points that you make, Gilfred, about those three factors, I think are really important ones, because when Lisa Osofsky made that speech about, using whistleblowers in a slightly different way, there was a lot of pearl clutching by, I think, many of us, like, how dare you, we don't do that, that's very un-British. And I think she was really being very practical and being American, and she seemed effective at it. But I do think that there was a little bit of pushback, and I think people are uncomfortable about that as a way in which we obtain information. But the question is, why shouldn't that be used? It is effective, so why not? But I think there's a Britishness about us that means that maybe isn't something that we see as the right, proper. But, the police use, moles and chisels to great effect. So why can't the SFO as an organisation follow that same model? So possibly they are taking steps in that direction. She's still fairly early on in her tenure. So we'll see whether or not she's able to encourage those case controllers and lawyers who lead these cases to utilize those additional tools that are already available to them.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
And this is, so with the DPAs will presumably be negotiated with the most senior people within the company, or at least kind of with their complicit agreement. Whereas the people who you would want to be the moles, or the people who are vulnerable to prosecution, might actually be slightly lower down. So I wonder whether there's disconnect between what's going into the DPAs, and ultimately the company wants the DPA to go ahead. So how robust is the prosecutor testing that DPA, or how robustly is the company pushing back on some aspects which actually they think are not quite right? I mean, there's basically both sides want to come to an agreement on it, whereas the people who are subject to the prosecution maybe might not have as much involvement as that DPA. So then they're presented with a kind of a fait complete of what the DPA says, which then sometimes doesn't always follow in the prosecution. And there's that kind of disconnect then between what's written on paper for the DPA and the issues that are being discussed at court. So, we see it as well. So I was thinking when we were talking this, I was thinking about antitrust, because I did cartel cases where there have been moles or people have been sent in with microphones and things like that. And that's worked quite well there. So it is something that can be done and can be done very effectively. But I agree with Lloydette, like it's something that the sort of, it was a lot of pearl clutching. People felt like, oh, that's a bit, like a TV show.
This is very, very interesting, Rachel, and this is opening to our next question, actually. This next question is about institutional vulnerability in terms of powers that the agency have and what they actually use to investigate this kind of crimes. So we know that different from other jurisdictions that we have looked at, the United Kingdom is quite a rich and country where there are skilled personnel. So I don't think that the issue here will be so much about the powers and the skill that you have, but there is something we have to discuss about. For example, building upon what Rachel said, the use of intrusive techniques, investigative techniques like phone tappings. This is a possibility, actually, both for corruption, serious fraud office, and both for tax crimes. but is this actually used? Do they use it? And you know, I was in the first case I was we were prosecuting. They asked me directly what we could do for assuring the individual liability of a person. I said, let's go for tapping for 2 years. And they answered me, what, Costa? What you are? Well, no, this won't happen. So why is that? Why do you think, you know, even if there are these powers, they are not used to unveil corruption and tax crime? Is this something related to what Mike said, that this is not the mainstream idea? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, if I can make a comment, actually, because it's an area that I'm particularly interested in the professionalisation project for the government, about better use of powers across agencies. I think it's true to say, actually, even now, that members of the SFO can't actually arrest anybody. Is that still the case? You have to use a different organisation. Yeah, so I mean, straight away, the most powerful organisation that's undertaking investigations into bribery and corruption, you know, doesn't have the most obvious power to arrest people. You know, so the dysfunctionality of the law enforcement landscape is clear for everybody to see. You know, the powers need to be equal across organisations who are undertaking criminal investigations. So that's probably one of the first points. I think somebody made the point about appetite, and I think it's a really good point. I think if the government had the appetite to actually tackle these problems effectively, then they would create, you know, an agency that could actually do it in a uniformed way and a more effective way, instead of keeping different 8 parts of government separate to undertake, you know, this part of the investigation, that part of the investigation. I mean, there's some obvious fixes that can be done to make sure we use all the powers that are available. You know, and to me, that's always been the obvious one. I mean, having been involved in a number of joint investigations, you know, I think it is, you know, remarkable that, you know, some of the basic powers aren't spread across the agencies. So we need to spread those powers to the people that can use them effectively.
Yeah, this is a very good answer, because this reconnect in relation to the appetite, it reconnects to why there is no this appetite. So maybe institutional corruption or this, and also in relation to the practical solution, why, for example, the SFO has no an in-house phone tapping division, and of course they have to delegate this, and they don't want to do that. And no, this is very clear, and I agree with that. This is very good answer. Any other Rachel?
That one of the difficulties, of course, with criminal prosecutions is that if you covertly record if I covertly recorded a telephone call with you, that can't be used as evidence in a criminal prosecution. So in the cases where I've had it where it has been used is where the recording has been done abroad. So we've been working, the prosecutors are working in tandem with a foreign prosecutor. So there are some cases where it can be used if it's in the UK, but you'd have to make a separate legal argument, or the prosecutor would, that it's in the interest of justice that it can be used. It's not like in America, or my understanding of America, of where if you have that recording, it can be used. This
is a very good answer. You need the judicial authorization in the UK. Yes, you need you cannot just do it by yourself, but you need all this complex procedure to fulfill, and if you don't, you cannot use it as evidence. You're right.
Even more than that. So obviously you have to go to the judge in the first place to get a warrant, that first step, and then you can use it for your investigation if you're a prosecutor. But there is the additional hurdle that yes, you can use it to find avenues for investigation, but then to actually be able to produce that evidence at court and say, here is the recording where somebody effectively makes a confession, you can't automatically use that in the UK in the same way that you can in some other jurisdictions.
Why do you think then that we have this burden? And this is happening in almost all jurisdictions. In anti-corruption, for having access to this kind of intrusive techniques that are the only one that are effective in unveiling, you know, these shady deals, why it's so complicated? What do you think? What is your critical analysis of this complexity?
Well, I mean, other people have other views, but as a defence solicitor, I would say that there is always issues of entrapment. And when there's a recording, one person knows that they're being recorded, the other person doesn't. It's not a true, accurate picture of the conversation because there's that distortion element to it. but they can be very effective, of course, I'm sure, in front of a jury if they were able to be used. It's definitely something that, that I could see that in the future the government might be wanting to look at and see if it's, it would definitely help. We've talked previously about, for tax cases, how difficult it is to get a jury to prosecute, and obviously we've discussed about the change in the definition of dishonesty and things, but still I think juries are very difficult to read in advance. So anything that could be done to help provide that kind of evidence to them, then it would.
Thank you, Rachel. Mike or Dilpreet?
I was just going to say, I think Rachel makes a really good point. I think the issue with, I think the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, whenever it came out in 2000, I think that caused some consternation. And so there is often, and I have had clients ask, do you know HMRC can record me? But it's exactly that, they do need to go to a judge, they do need to obtain a warrant. But again, then the issue that comes in is context, and judges are generally mindful of this, juries aren't, and we don't have the option here like, our colleagues across the pond do, of jury selection. You get who you have effectively, whether you think juror number 7 looks particularly engaged or not. And I think is that those selections of calls or conversations are taken out of context very often, to the prosecutor's advantage, and that's precisely why they bring them on board and try and get them admitted into evidence. And I think those are the dangers. There's also the gateways of evidence in the UK that make that sort of evidence, once it's in, very difficult to ignore.
Thank you very much. If we don't have other comments on this, the last sub question in this.
I think
yes. Before coming to the project experts, so there will be Mary. We can go back on this, of course, if you would like, but let me close this topic. The last thing, we already spoke a bit about that, so very briefly, the knowledge gap. So the knowledge gap between the highly specialized private players, the big 4 and international law firm, and public authorities. Is there a knowledge gap, and how much this affects, in a way, anti-tax crime and corruption strategies? Who would like to? Nobody?
I'll have a go.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I don't think the gap is much in the UK, if at all, because obviously private practice tends to pay more, but that doesn't mean that the state that public officials are not well equipped to do their job. In HMRC, for example, they instruct counsel in litigation, in trials, so they can bring in private practice expertise when needed. But the in-house team, in my experience, was as good as any top law firm.
Okay, so that was quite intuitive in this jurisdiction. The knowledge gap is not so much. There is more some technical issues about powers and the possibility of investigation. So I will now open the floor for the project experts to intervene. Mary, please.
Thanks, Costa. We were just talking about what tools can be used to, and the idea of recording, but also more importantly, the idea of whistleblowers as a tool for addressing tax fraud. The experts were talking about Lisa Osofsky at the SFO and the potential of rewards. I know Rachel referenced the Competition and Markets Authority has a reward program, but I was hoping that the experts could comment. I feel like the HMRC has already crossed the Rubicon. They have a discretionary whistleblower reward program in the form of a hotline. I know the data that comes out of there, they don't publicize it very much, but some FOI requests and reporting have shown they typically only pay about £400,000 a year in rewards. But I would like to get a sense from the panelists about their use of that program, whether they think that's effective, because it does feel like HMRC has already decided whistleblowers are important. They have the hotline, and as I think Rachel also mentioned, we saw it ringing off the hook during COVID for the furlough fraud. So But I guess I'm more directly talking about in terms of beyond whistleblower protections, there are rewards for whistleblowers. They actually get paid money for bringing the information forward. The idea being, of course, to compensate them for undertaking the enormous risk of speaking out.
Thank you, Mary. And of course, this will be question number 11, but let's anticipate. So let's discuss about this now. So before answering directly to Mary, can you also explain to us what is your opinion about the role of whistleblowers in anti-tax crime cases? So are they relevant? Are they important? What do you think about that? And then please answer the specific question Mary posed to you. Thank you very much.
Can I start on this one? Sure. So, I think whistleblowers are very important in tax, because if you have to remember, the disadvantage the tax authority has is that it doesn't have the complete facts. And there are legal rules, including legal privilege, on which taxpayer can use to conceal facts. So that makes any additional information you can get from whistleblowers extremely important. But as others have said before, there's a cultural reluctance to use whistleblowers in the UK, and it's very much rife in HMRC. So as Mary said, there's a hotline. HMRC invites whistleblowers to come and talk to them. But once you mention reward or any form of advantage, you're off. There is no reward system. What happens is that if you give useful information, HMRC can, in their discretion, give you something if they want to, but they don't bargain with you. When I worked in personal tax litigation, we'll be approached by people that have used tax schemes and are facing a tax bill. And they say, we have evidence that this is fraud. If you let me off my tax bill, I'll give you the evidence. But we don't do that. At the point at which the whistleblower asks for anything, you have to cease all contact. That's HMRC's policy. So they don't encourage any form of positive reward. If you help them, they can then decide in the goodness of their heart to give you something. But they don't bargain with whistleblowers at all.
Thank you very much. So that's a bit the dark side of the fact that it's discretionary. Let's see, somebody else would like to intervene. Dilpreet, please.
I think that the role of whistleblowers is really important. Actually, I think though that there is a risk that the culture of sort of saying there are some really catchy headlines. I remember reading about these things like snitches get riches and whatnot. So there are obviously mechanisms in place that I think they've actually borrowed from the SEC, if I'm not mistaken, but things like, the whistleblower's got to be providing original information. This has got to lead to some sort of successful or at least probative track. It's not just, I know this chap and this is what I think is happening. I don't know if there's a cap or a limit past which this happens, but I think that those sorts of mechanisms in place make the whistleblower scheme one that is perhaps more trusted, reliable, and makes people sort of think through what it is that they are doing, first of all, because I think just picking up a phone in a fit of anger or in a moment or an emotional moment to say you're going to report something that you have no probative evidence on, I think is a really dangerous thing to encourage, actually. So when we're talking about whistleblowers, it's the first stop is to realize, well, a genuine whistleblower with actual probative evidence. Second is to have mechanisms in place that sort of separate a whistleblower that is rewarded versus one who isn't. And then thirdly, going to Mary's point of, what do we think of these people who do get rewarded? I think if there is a genuine scheme that is uncovered or that comes to light, I don't think that's a bad thing, particularly in circumstances where HMRC struggles in any event to capture with any increasing accuracy the sorts of tax evasion that we've been talking about. But I think there is a real risk as identifying the whistleblower as being the person to be targeted here. They are merely a conduit of information. And that's where I find this a very interesting topic, but I don't think it's explored in enough detail and certainly even academically.
Yeah, this is very good point, and let's try to explore it right now a bit more. When you said about a genuine whistleblower, of course you mentioned about the reliability of the evidence. This is of course the main thing. What about the motivations? So do you think the motivations are important or they are not? I know this is a tricky question, and like that, please like that.
It's not a tricky question, because I'm going to get on my soapbox a bit here, because this is something that I've been wrestling and dealing with, actually been quite vocal about it on LinkedIn as well. It's really about, I think as a prosecutor, a former prosecutor, I've really been challenged speaking to whistleblowers, as well as those who work with whistleblowers, around how we as lawyers approach whistleblowers. And one of the things I firstly wanted to say was that it's important for us to separate the information that a whistleblower provides from the whistleblower themselves. And so it's important to look at that information on its own first. And then, absolutely, because as a prosecutor, you're thinking about, well, if this information is valuable, I'm going to need this individual as a witness. I'm going to need to do criminal checks, criminal background checks on them. I'm going to see they'll be to withstand examination in chief, and most importantly, cross-examination at some later stage. But I think oftentimes our first instinct as lawyers is really to say, who is this person? What's their motive? What have they got to say? Why are they doing this? Rather than looking at the information first. And so we have to separate the two. And I think the first thing that we should look at is the information that is being provided and the value of that information.
This is a fantastic answer. Thank you very much. And any other comments from the project, for the national experts on this point? Motivation, if the whistleblower is a disgruntled employee, is this relevant?
I think it's highly irrelevant, because at that point you start imputing, and so it's exactly, I wholly agree with Laudette, and goes to the point I was saying earlier, which is the whistleblower is merely a conduit of information. They're nothing more than that, really. And what you're rewarding is their bravery or their courage for saying, I'm going to come forward because I know I could be a target, because in our society, we're not able to always separate the two. I think when you start looking at their motivation, at least from an English law perspective, you're beginning to impute, the criminal intent of what's the mens rea, what's the mental mindset here. But that's irrelevant, because the tax fraud or the evasion is happening. Why the person's chosen to tell you because they're a disgruntled employee, or because they're actually the happiest employee, but they're about to retire and they don't really care, and they think this is the moral high ground that they're taking as they exit, is utterly immaterial in my view, particularly for the purposes of tax fraud and whistleblowing.
Thank you very much. I think that this is a very, very good point. And Osita, please.
Can I just make one point in support of my fellow panelists? As a whistleblower myself, clearly the motive shouldn't be relevant at all. It just is a message, as everyone says, that matters. And this is particularly important in the UK, where there is no established reward system. So from the beginning, it's all pain and no gain. If it was a case where in the US, where there's monetary incentives, even there, where people can be motivated by financial reward, they're still able to separate the message from the messenger.
This is very, very interesting, and I can just anticipate to you, but you will see when we will publish the workshop, the answer in Greece has been totally the opposite. All of them, they said that for the culture in Greece, motivation are fundamental, and they don't want, they want to assess motivation, and this is fundamental, even if many whistleblowers will be not accepted as whistleblowers for these reasons, but they want only the good ones. So how deeply these cultural biases or these cultural structures are important in the phenomenon of whistleblowing is an emergence. So it's very interesting to see the difference between jurisdictions about the approach to whistleblowing. Any case of whistleblowing that you, in the area of taxation, tax crime, tax evasion, that in your mind is there, oh, this case, there was a whistleblower, it was a very important case? Very quickly.
Sorry, can I just quickly go back and actually just say that if you have a whistleblower, the material that they can bring, if they can go and bring primary evidence, emails and so on, then that their motivation doesn't really matter. But if their evidence is going to be their account of their memory, then then the defense lawyers will try to undermine their evidence by their motivation. So while I can see that motivation isn't necessarily sort of the be all and end all, it can become very important at a criminal trial. So just to mention that.
Yeah.
Rachel, this is a fantastic answer, because this, from academic point of view, this looks at the difference between a whistleblower and a witness, and when they are related or not. So yeah, but we don't have the time to explore all the, oh yes, please.
Can I just buttress that point by just saying absolutely right, you know, and that's what is in my mind as a former prosecutor when a witness, you know, when a whistleblower approaches the SFO. I think actually sometimes we think it has to be either or. First of all, I would look at the information first, but I think people can have multiple motives. They can be wanting to do the right thing, as well as be a disgruntled employee, as well as a number of other things. We're complex people, so they can have a multitude of motives. But whether or not that disqualifies them from being able to take the stand in a criminal trial is another question. If you have obviously issues around dishonesty, you know, that person has been found guilty of dishonesty offences, you know, as a prosecutor, you go, oh, it's dead in the water. but it shouldn't necessarily be that. And I think it's important that what I've seen over the last few years, I think over the last 5 years, is the discourse around whistleblowers really moving forward. And I think that can only be a positive thing.
Fantastic. Let's go ahead with this. To your knowledge, are acts of retaliation against whistleblowers who uncover tax crimes or corruption frequent within our jurisdiction or not?
I just say very briefly that I was a victim of retaliation by HMRC for exposing corruption in HMRC.
What kind of retaliation, if you could say this?
Well, so basically, I was subjected to criminal investigation for suspected leaking of confidential information. So they used RIPA to monitor my private communication and my wife's communication with a view to establish connection between myself and journalists. Obviously, I did not speak to journalists. I gave information to a select committee in order to be protected by parliamentary privilege. So that I didn't have any contact with officials. So when they didn't find any evidence to do anything about it, they then kept me out of work. So they put me on what they called special leave for almost a year. In the end, I just got tired of it. And
so, Osita, can you confirm were you subject to intrusive investigative techniques?
Yes.
So the one that we say they don't use with usually with corrupt people, potentially corrupt individual, they used it against a whistleblower. This is very good emergence, I think, for our research. Thank you so much, Osita.
They do, and in HMRC, the authorization is at a very low level, actually. It wasn't even board level or director level. It was quite relatively junior official. So they could do that.
Very interesting. Any other comment in relation to the retaliation suffered by whistleblowers?
I think oftentimes whistleblowers sometimes don't even recognize that they've been retaliated against because it can be quite subtle. It's not often the case that you may not lose your job because we've got current legislation, which is PIDA, which is not a great piece of legislation really and needs to go. But you know, there could be other ways in which individuals are retaliated against. And I was listening to a webinar a few months ago, and somebody who really focuses on this area, and they did a survey, and it was a British individual. They did a survey of those who identified as whistleblowers, said, have you been retaliated against? They go, no, everything's fine. And then they started listing all these different things. Has this happened to you? Have you, has your performance grade changed this last year, even though you've always got exceptional? Have you had this and this and this? And they go, oh yeah, that happened to me. And so sometimes there isn't even a recognition that they have had retaliatory action taken against them. It's not always as blatant as losing your job or being passed over for promotion. There could be other subtle things that happen in order to retaliate against individuals and to frustrate them and get them to move out of the organization, etc., etc.
This is a very, very good point. And project experts, any other comment on whistleblowing or?
Yes, thank you very much. I just would like to ask additional question. What are the main sources of crime reporting more generally in the UK? And is there do you have any experience with some informal channels in comparison to formal channels of incident reporting?
Thank you for the question. Let's try to restrict this to tax crimes and relating corrupt practices. How do you usually emerge these crimes? Dilpreet.
I mean, I know that the National Crime Agency holds statistics, and I think if you contact them, you can get breakdowns for specific areas. They're probably a pretty reliable source insofar as sources go. I know that the Tax Justice Network, John Christensen, I think, has had to jump off. Unfortunately, he might have been able to tell us, but I know that they keep sort of good data on these things. But the National Crime Agency is probably the best one because it's a government-run one.
Okay, so our national leading expert will try to contact, I hope, NCA. Yeah,
I'm not sure if also the ONS might be a good one in terms of the information that they collect. And then what we found in terms of, if you're talking about tax crime and possibly linked to whistleblowers, I think the FCA, HMRC, and a number of other organisations now publish their own statistics in relation to what crimes are reported and what, whether whistleblowers were involved, etc., etc. So you might want to go on a departmental basis as well.
That's very useful. Thank you very much, Lloydette. Now, going back to question 10, and then just the last question. The last question is an open question. You will see nothing specific. Question 10 was about corporate criminal liability, but we have spoken about that a lot. So this is something very clear to us also because we work in this jurisdiction. So I have only a question about this. And this is related to the introduction of the failure to prevent tax evasion offense. And of course, we spoke about that in positive terms. And we said that not been used yet, but there are some investigation ongoing and maybe other investigation will follow soon. So besides these positive, aspects, what do you think are the limits? Because if you look at that, the use of quasi-strict liability in relation to corporate tax crime seems a revolutionary thing that no other countries has adopted so far. In Italy, for example, tax crime are not even included in the predicate offense for corporate crime. Imagine that. So it's the totally opposite approach. So let's try to be a bit critical about this. So how often do you think a very big corporation will be subject to this kind of things, or will just use aggressive tax avoidance schemes that, because they are tax avoidance schemes, are not included in the notion of fraudulent practices or tax evasion? So is this something that really is all gold, this that glitters or not? That's the point. What do you think?
Personally, I would say my main criticism of that legislation is the defense of putting in place adequate safeguards to prevent the commission of the crime, because it means you can just absolve yourself of responsibility by having very good mechanisms in place while still benefiting from the process of the crime. So, and this was what I think. This was because the legislation went through Parliament under Gauche. We have a subjective test of dishonest. Now you have Gentin's casino, which is objective. I think that's defense would undermine the law.
Okay, this is interesting. Let's not delve into the draconian nature of this defense. In reality, I was asking about the scope of application. So, for big corporation, how often big corporation will be, involved in tax evasion schemes rather than aggressive tax avoidance schemes?
I think it's not necessarily about how many prosecutions there are, it's about how it changes the culture. Because if it's so successful that it changes the culture and therefore it doesn't ever need to be used, well, it's done what it needed to do. And from there's certainly a lot of widespread knowledge especially in finance, you know, in the industries that we discussed earlier as being the ones that are most at risk. I think this has had an impact, and where at first it might just be lip service, as having these reasonable procedures in place with the training and the whistleblowing line and all of those things, there's a chance, or more than a chance, that it could change the culture. So that's ultimately what the aim is.
This is a good point. Thank you, Rachel. If project experts about this corporate liability for tax crimes?
Yes, thank you. Are we going to get any case anytime soon, really, that we can actually read and analyze? Or I'm checking regularly. I know there was already a long time ago now so many investigations going on, but we have been waiting for quite some time for a bribery act cases. We have now quite nice material. What would be your projection here?
Let's try to have a projection not only in terms of quantity but also quality. So big corporations or small players. I know it's gambling. It's just it's just an opinion. You know, this is not. But you know, for the sake of the discussion, Rachel.
I think that there's probably going to be a medium to small, probably, rather than the big ones. I don't think we're going to see massive corporations, but I don't know. And I wonder if maybe we'll see a DPA before an actual prosecution. But this is, you know, hypothetical. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. So time is running short. So Lloydette, and then we go to the last question. Lloydette.
So I think that the pandemic will definitely have an impact on what we will see, what the landscape will look like over the next 18, 24 months. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, but we also know that HMRC have already identified, I think, something like £3 to £4 billion worth of, you know, fraudulent claims, etc., etc. So that there are lots of moving parts at the moment that make it difficult, and with Rachel, make it difficult to really see where things will lie. But I think the pandemic will not only be keep HMRC, SFO, and other law enforcement agencies busy, but it'll also keep those in private practice extremely busy going forwards.
Thank you very much. So time is 6. So time for the last question. The last question is, if you had a magic wand to improve the anti-tax crime strategies and relating anti-corruption strategies in this jurisdiction, what you would like to do? And I will start this. This is all open also to project experts. I will start this with Michael, because Michael has been here, listen to all our discussion. So Michael, now you are the depository of this knowledge. What are your words of wisdom?
That's a tough billing to follow. So it's been fascinating for me as a former tax enforcer for the United States for about a decade before I started doing whistleblower work, to hear the comparative perspective. So I guess 2 quick things that jumped out at me. One, early on, we talked about the tension between simplicity and complexity in the code. And one thing I find interesting about that is, I think it was acknowledged that the complexity comes about as we try to plug holes. But at the same time, in my enforcement days, we were often arguing the simple explanation. The tax, I would say it's more tax avoiders than evaders who are doing this sort of thing, right? But they're lining up a series of loopholes and explaining why everything is technically possible. And the enforcers are appealing to more of a common sense, simple view of, we can all see this as a sham. You did 14 things, but the money goes in a circle. So I find that to be an interesting quandary. How do we stop holes while retaining the simplicity we need to actually, succeed in the enforcement? And then a completely unrelated comment, since I now work with whistleblowers, a thought on the award or reward discussion. I think you're right to emphasize the cultural aspects. We've seen them shift here in the United States a lot. One note I did have was that there's an important economic role with the rewards, not just to incentivize other whistleblowers, but there's also a justification in giving it to an individual because of the conversation we had about retaliation, right? A lot of people end up with their careers ruined by coming forward. And so if you're giving someone what may seem like a windfall that can actually support them, through the rest of what would have been their career.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And let's ask Donato. Donato?
Because I think it was a fantastic discussion and about all these topics. I have no question at the moment. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to hear about all these fantastic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Donato. I don't know if Adam is back. Adam, are you back? Because we wanted to know what the media think about this. And unfortunately, we cannot hear about the press now, I think. So let's see Mary then.
Thanks, Costa. You said we could use magic and use blue sky thinking. My magic wand fix for UK tax fraud would be not to simply do the equivalent of the IRS whistleblower program, which actually makes it mandatory that if you provide useful information, it's mandatory that you get an award. I would go beyond that. In New York State and now in the District of Columbia, instead of just using whistleblowers as a source of tips, you're allowed under the False Claims Act, which is a law that we actually stole the concept from the UK, from English common law. A whistleblower can launch a lawsuit in the name of the government. In New York State, they have recovered over 500 million in tax, in the tax gap as a result of whistleblowers bringing that information forward. So I would suggest that they consider and that helps get past a lot of the resource issues, right? Because you have a force multiplier with the whistleblower leading the investigation and leading the charge.
Okay, fantastic, Mary. And now Branislav.
No, thank you so much. I have been asking so many questions. If I would have some magical ball, I think I would try to define fiscal corruption in a way to allow quite disorganized and fragmented enforcement authorities to understand and realize and be able to prosecute substantively fragmented offenses, large cases that involve tax evasion, money laundering, bribery, and other offenses, and have more holistic approach to that. Because I think that often it's up to the prosecutor how they gonna qualify the conduct that is taking place. Yeah, so I think we should work more with the fact that these big cases overlap and that they involve many different crimes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Branislav. So now, even if we are not in a criminal trial, we give the last words to the national experts. So let's start with the Lloydette.
Hi, could you do me next? I've just got to deal with something. I can hear.
Yeah, of course I can. Of course. So I'm not following an alphabetical order here. So Osita.
Thank you very much. What I would do, the one thing I would do is to redress the balance between the enforcement of the criminal law and revenue collection. You have to remember what the criminal law is there to do. It's there to make sure that the system works very well, to enforce the rule of law, and to provide a level playing field for everybody. Because if you allow some people to get away with it, everybody else is put at a disadvantage. So I would bring in more criminal investigation, first of all, to get the vital evidence that is currently lacking under the civil procedure, and then also to bring in more prosecution to act as a deterrent to tax crime.
Thank you very much. Rachel.
I know with Brexit, there's obviously, and not just Brexit, but there's a political element in terms of prosecuting corporates. But ultimately, if we do want to get more money into the Treasury, then there is a benefit to going to corporates who are due to pay much more tax than individuals, and incentivizing them. And hopefully the CCO will do that. But if not, then HMRC have got to have the confidence to be able to bring those big prosecutions. And of course, if they go wrong, it could be the opposite of a deterrent. That's the risk.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. Dilpreet.
So I think there are two aspects here. One is how far we start pushing against rules such as the revenue rule, because I think in the day and age of corporates that have, a variety of permanent establishments globally, they may be incorporated in some offshore jurisdiction, but the idea of being able to collect the tax that's due and owing to a particular nation state, I think the revenue rule, which has served us, very well and served everybody very well globally, is fine until I think today's day and age where e-commerce and the role of multinationals and how they operate, I think is becoming very, very challenging for the tax collector. So rather than prosecuting for the sake of prosecuting because HMRC must hit certain targets, it's about saying, well, what's actually going on here and where is the biggest tax evasion lying? And I'm not sure that it's just within a single geographical border. That would probably be where I think some of the tax crime corruption and some of the more automatic exchange of information might also act as deterrents to taxpayers. So they might think a little more carefully about where they're setting up why, and being a bit more frank about, say, disclosure of information, because they know either which way, they're going to be taxed and they'll be taxed correctly, but with automatic exchange of information, they'll be taxed in the right place and they'll, hopefully save from double taxation, as it were.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dilpreet. Mike.
Yeah, I think I'd probably think about doing two things, actually. I think the language that we talk is not very accessible to the majority of people. So I think if you combine the word tax and fraud, straight away, probably a large part of the population are probably turned off by that area of criminality. So I think the messaging and the rebranding of this area of criminality would be important to make it accessible and understandable. So I quite like the tagging theft from the people, stealing from the people, to try and bring this area of criminality back home to the population. To the majority of the victims will be us and the people and the population. So I think the messaging is really important, and to make sure it's accessible and people understand it, not only to the general population, but also probably to law enforcement. So I think making sure that education about the harm of tax crime is, educated to society in a much stronger way, but also to the law enforcement agencies. Because I know 34 years in policing, it was never an area that we really reflected upon, and working in the heart of fraud investigation, after listening to today's sort of panel, actually, it really should be very much at the forefront of our thinking. We probably did see it an awful lot, but never really engaged with it. So I think education, and accessibility of the crime typology to a much wider group of people. So that's my two things.
Thank you so much, Mike. And last but not least, Lloydette.
Sorry about that, everybody. I think my kids were going to run riot because they haven't been fed yet. But I was just going to say that for me, I think part of the issue that we have, I completely echo what Mike said about education and how we reframe the narrative. But I think also there's something that sticks in the throats of people who see Amazon and huge companies, trillion-dollar companies, paying less tax than, an SME. in Birmingham. There's something about that makes it really difficult for the average person to say, hang on a minute, this is outrageous, it's out of order. And I think sometimes our tax authorities are, and across the world actually, they're scared of tackling those bigger beasts. So I think part of if I was to wave my magic wand, is really around how do we ensure that the taxes that are due are paid. And there's some things that give me hope around that. Number one, well, could give me hope, but will probably make me cry as well. It's been the discussion around, what's a minimum global tax, that should be paid in different jurisdictions. And I think, when you listen to the wranglings and the discussions that have been had about that, I don't know if it fills you with hope or despair, to be perfectly honest. I think a combination of the two. Jurisdictions fighting for who's going to offer the lowest tax to these corporates. So I think there's an issue there between the disparity between how the very, very wealthy are treated versus how the average person is treated. And I think it makes it difficult to move forward. I am encouraged by HMRC moving into an area where, they've set up the Tax Crime Alliance, which is to bring on board, practitioners, law firms, accountancy firms, and a range of other, regulators and professional bodies, really to hang heads and collaborate and share knowledge about how we can tackle tax crime. So that's a great initiative. I hope we're yet to see what it produces, but it's a good start. And I think that was launched only a couple of weeks ago. So for me, I'd like to see some tackling of that top level of tax evasion, avoidance, whatever it is.
Thank you very much. So before pausing the recording or stopping it, actually, I would like to say thank you so much for contributing to this fascinating and inspiring discussion on such sensitive topics. So thank you very much. It was a frank and honest discussion, and I will let you know when this recording will be available on the website of the project.